At a time of deep division in today's society, we must come together for humanity's sake. On Can We Talk 360, we strive to stimulate an authentic conversation on issues that affect all of us in an environment of tolerance. I am Eugene Pettis, attorney and community servant. Tune into our discussion to foster a greater awareness of yourself and others. Let's discover how there is strength in our differences and an abundance of possibilities when we stand together as one humanity. Welcome to Can We Talk 360. We're pleased to have with us today Jessica Khan Obanoff. Jessica is with the United States Attorney's Office. She's an assistant USA. Has had an extensive experience both at the State Attorney's Office as well as the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District in Miami and currently in Fort Pierce. She spent the last 5 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office and additional years at the State Attorney's Office. And I'm going to have her to discuss with us human trafficking. It's a topic that I do a program on every January because it's recognized as Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And I don't think it's anything that we can take for granted. We all need to be aware of it. It's real, even within some of our communities. So we're looking forward to Jessica's expertise. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Tell us, just of all, when we're speaking of human trafficking, define that term for us.
So broadly, human trafficking is the exploitation of another through some sort of force, fraud, or coercion to compel that person to engage in either commercial sex or labor.
And is there go ahead.
Just to add, so for adults, the law distinguishes between adults and minors. And so when you're talking about human trafficking as it relates to minors, whether or not, there's some sort of force, fraud, or coercion used, a minor cannot consent to engage in commercial sex. And so we do not have to prove that there is some sort of force, fraud, or coercion. If a person forces a minor or buys sex from a minor, they are guilty of sex trafficking a minor.
And how long have you been in this area of sex trafficking?
So for the past almost 5 years of my federal career, I've been the human trafficking coordinator and the Project Safe Childhood coordinator for the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. And so the bulk of my work for the U.S. Attorney's Office has been involved in human trafficking and child exploitation. A lot of times there's major overlap in those areas. And so in those roles, I have both supervised those cases within the office and then also trained and consulted and advised law enforcement and the public in how to identify human trafficking and combat it. So before that, I worked before the U.S. Attorney's Office. So at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I've been here for now 8.5 years. Prior to that, I was at the State Attorney's Office in Palm Beach County for 8.5 years. And 5 of those years, I was in the Special Victims Unit, where I prosecuted crimes against children, elderly, and other vulnerable populations. So I've been doing it for the better part of my career. It's tough work, but it is very rewarding.
What are there recognized from experience age groups that are more vulnerable to human trafficking, sex trafficking than other demographics?
Well, I think minors are always, just by the sheer fact of their age, they're not yet developed fully, and they're very impressionable. I think that minors are at the highest risk. And then when you compound the age with other risk factors, such as maybe an unstable home life, so we see a lot of kids in the foster care system, runaways, children with unstable home lives that they are then approached by a trafficker and offered, promises of love and stability and a roof over their head and money. So I would say that minors are at the highest risk, but really when you talk about being at risk for being trafficked, you know, traffickers will say that, they find a weakness, they find a vulnerability, and they exploit it. And that a lot of times doesn't have anything to do with age. It just has to do with vulnerability. And so we see throughout our cases a lot of common vulnerabilities, such as drug abuse. Drug addiction is a really high one. We've seen an increase in drug-based coercion trafficking cases, where the trafficker acts as the drug dealer. And so a lot of times victims are told by traffickers that they are only able to get their drug supply from the trafficker, and therefore the trafficker then controls it. And so they wait until the victim becomes strung out or in need of drugs, and then they use that as a method of control. Homelessness is a big one. And really, a lot of times it's an unstable, maybe it's a lack of self-esteem, or that the person has grown up without feeling loved. And so I would say that the most common form of recruitment and control would be through promises of love, that maybe that victim has never felt like anybody has truly cared for them in their lives. And so we have what is known as a Romeo trafficker, which is the most common type, where they just swoop in, they act like, hey, I'm your boyfriend, I love you, together it's us against the world. And then pretty shortly after the relationship is established, then he flips the script and he says, oh, we need some money to support ourselves. And then he introduces them to the world of commercial sex.
In the state of Florida, how big of a problem do we have?
We have a huge problem in Florida, and specifically in South Florida. We are consistently among the highest in the Southern District of Florida of the districts across the country in number of cases charged for human trafficking. And I attribute that to having a really robust program down here, but also a really big problem. We have cases that happen, a lot of times they happen just within the confines of Miami-Dade County, Broward County. There's no travel involved. But, because we have perhaps a strong nightlife, a lot of people come down here as tourists, so we have victims who are brought here, but we have victims who are just maybe runaways, they're living on the street, and then they're approached by traffickers here. But so the Southern District of Florida, across the district, and in Florida in general, we have a huge problem.
Within the state, is there exposure, I think, among the areas you talked about: drug abuse, loneliness, lack of self-esteem, love, Romeo trafficker, all of those different identities of the trafficker, are places like South Beach where there's deep late nightlife, alcohol, drugs. Are those places more vulnerable spots?
Yes, and actually we've had many cases where victims have been brought to that area specifically for that purpose. I mean, traffickers, it's all about the money, right? They see victims as another product, just like drugs. And so, the more they sell that product, the more money they make. And so, we have traffickers who bring victims down to that area to walk the street. Certain areas, it's called the track. We also, with heavy use of the internet, we have, different online websites that are used to advertise in that area. But yeah, especially when the Super Bowl was down here a few years ago in Miami, we had a number of cases that resulted from that, where the trafficker brought the victims down to Miami to work in that area, thinking they were going to make a lot of money.
We've talked about sex trafficking. how, if you have any knowledge, how big is the labor trafficking problem here in the state?
So labor trafficking is, it's of the different types of human trafficking, it's the most underreported.
Mhm.
And just based on my own personal experience, I think that probably has a lot to do with labor trafficking. Many times deals with victims who are foreign nationals. And so when you have a person who has come from meager means and has come over to the States, many times consensually. You have a lot of cases that it was consensual smuggling. So they consented to come over here for the promise of a better life and thinking that they could earn money for their families to send back to their countries. And then they're taken advantage of while they're here. And so the number one, I would say in labor trafficking cases, the number one method of coercion and control is really using that fear of immigration and law enforcement
Mhm.
threat. Well, if you don't do what I say, or if you leave the house, or whatever it is, I'm going to report you to immigration.
I'll call ICE or something.
Correct. And that has a real impact on a person's willingness to report it, because they're unfamiliar with our system, and so maybe they come from a place where law enforcement doesn't help, they hurt, and so they really believe that. And so I think, especially, we have our large agricultural areas. We have labor trafficking in other areas, such as the housekeeping, nannies, those different careers. But so we see those cases happen. We hear about them, just not as often as I know that they're occurring.
Right.
So it's really tough the data is not reliable in that sense.
When you're out there, you're the prosecutor, if you will. You all are trying to enforce the laws as it relates to this particular area. What partners do you have? How do you find out about a case? You have something going on in Miami, Broward, wherever, in South Florida in general. How does it get to your desk?
So we have task forces in place throughout the district. The South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force is one that I've been heavily involved in Miami, and it's comprised of a board that has Homeland Security investigations, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, Miami-Dade Police Department, and the International Rescue Committee. And then we have members from all different types of walks of life. Maybe they're survivors of human trafficking. We have a lot of non-governmental organization victim service providers that participate. And so we get tips from everywhere. We have, if somebody is in the airport or in the hospital and they see something that they think might be trafficking, they can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And so what happens is, when that phone call is made, or that text message is made, that is distributed then to law enforcement partners in the area where the trafficking is occurring. So that's also another way that we get tips. We get notified that, hey, this person called in and reported this, and this is the location they provided, this is the information they provided. And then we deconflict among the agencies, and we assign the leads to an agency to go follow up on. And then a lot of times we partner. And so many of our cases, because we work on these task forces, many of our cases, we have multiple agencies involved. A few years ago, I worked a big case. William Foster is the defendant's name. He received a 60-year sentence from Judge Singal in Fort Lauderdale. And he had been trafficking minors and adults for decades. And, there would be a girl that would report it. There would be a police report. And then, there was just nothing that ever came of it for whatever reason. And then finally, the FBI and HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, teamed up. And by the time we were finished, we had a spreadsheet of more than 75 females that they had identified who had gone through Foster's organization. And so I always talk about, when I do training for law enforcement, I often talk about that case, because I think that is the model case for what can happen if the agencies partner. And so I am a huge proponent of that, you know, in having that force multiplier. You know, why not have more people involved in an investigation? Because every agency brings something different to the table, because they all have different focuses.
Right.
So, you know, there's a number of ways that we get leads.
What was missing, or to allow him to stay out there for decades? What piece was letting him get off, if you will, or get unidentified?
He was just really good at what he did. He was really good at lying and manipulating the victims into believing that if they stuck with him, if they worked really hard, you know, in this case, they worked primarily out of strip clubs. And so, and then they would have, you know, commercial sex encounters in the strip clubs and outside the strip clubs. But he told them, like, hey, if you work, you know, all day, 6 days a week, give me all your money, I will invest it. And by the time you're in your mid-20s, you'll be able to retire. And so, and then he had them, you know, a lot of times traffickers, in order to maintain that control, they will restrict their freedom to associate with whoever they want. They restrict their actual movement, you know, what they eat, who they talk to, what they're allowed to do, you know, what they're allowed to buy. You know, these victims had to ask permission if they wanted to buy hygiene products. And so, you know, he was just, I hate saying very good, because what he did was despicable, but he had such a stronghold over the victims that he was able to operate out in the open, you know, because a lot of these victims were encountered by a lot of people in the public, but a lot of from the outside, a lot of people would have said, hey, they're loving their life, you know, they're flourishing, when in reality, he was exploiting them in the worst ways. And so, unfortunately, he was able to operate for far too long.
When we talk about sex trafficking, for whatever reason, you think of females being trafficked. How much male trafficking, if any, do we see?
The overwhelming majority of trafficking victims are female.
Mhm.
And the overwhelming majority of traffickers are males, although I have personally seen many female traffickers come through during COVID and after. And I don't know if COVID was a reason for that, but I just, you know, we started seeing more female traffickers. You know, we do see male trafficking victims. Sometimes it's just, it's not as common.
Right. Are there any ongoing programs that bring education of trafficking and the warnings of trafficking into the public school systems?
So we do training programs for the schools, for both parents and children. I know that FBI, HSI, Miami-Dade PD also do that. And I know that it's also occurring in the more northern part of the district. I've personally done those trainings. A lot of times there is a strong overlap with online safety, because there are just so many ways for predators to enter the sanctity of a home and exploit children right under the nose of a very diligent, caring parent. And it's always shocking to hear the stories, and even, you know, it's touched my personal life, and those around me who I care about and who are really vigilant parents, and yet, you know, it continues to happen. So I always tell parents that we really need to control, your child's use of a smartphone, even gaming systems. They're infiltrating gaming systems, and it's pretty scary.
Yeah, and technology is getting more and more plentiful at earlier ages. As I stand and look at society from my vantage point, what are, as a common citizen, what should we be looking for to try to identify if someone is a victim of trafficking? Are there any signs, that are common to some of these cases, or be on the lookout for this, that, or the other?
Sure. For a parent, who's paying attention to their child, I would say anything, any behavior, any difference in their behavior, I think needs to be explored. I think unexplained wealth or gifts, a lot of times these traffickers will buy their minor victims a cell phone, so if a child has an unexplained cell phone, or unexplained money, or, toys or a gaming system or whatever it is, I would explore that. Secrecy. I think also maybe a sudden dislike for their parents, where you have a child who has always had a very good relationship with their parents, and all of a sudden they're maybe being disrespectful or secretive, because a lot of times traffickers will isolate their victims. They will tell the victims that nobody cares about them the way that they do, and their parents are lying to them, and to try to break that bond. But in public, I would say, our healthcare providers are in a really good place to identify trafficking when they're caring for a patient, and maybe there is an older male or just a male in general who, the patient isn't making eye contact with the healthcare provider, but if they're asked a question, the patient will look at the male in the room for almost like permission to answer. If they're asked for their documents and they don't have them, or phone and they don't have it, and they look to the male in the room and he's holding their documents or phone, different methods of control. Obvious signs would be, injuries. And so I say healthcare provider because a lot of times our victims report for treatment, and so they're in a really good place to be able to report it. But also, you may see these signs, on the bus or at the airport or in a restaurant, And so if you see something, I know this sounds cliche, but if you see something, say something, and that's why the National Human Trafficking Hotline is so great, because you can call with whatever information, and that information will be investigated.
One of the questions I had when preparing is, when you speak of human trafficking, are these people typically captured within whatever space defined by the trafficker? Or are there occasions where the trafficking is allowing them to go back to their home, for lack of a better word, and come back tomorrow or come back upon demand to participate in the activities the trafficker desires for them to participate in?
Yeah, so you would be surprised. I think that a lot of people have this misconception that trafficking victims are chained to a wall, and they're not allowed to leave, right? I mean, we certainly have had that scenario. I tried a case last year where a Latin King member was holding his victims in his house, and he had screwed all the windows shut, and then he had a deadbolt on his door, and he carried the key around his neck. Now that happens, don't get me wrong, we see cases like that, but that is that's rare. Right. The more common fact pattern or, scheme that we see is that, and it has a name, it's called automatic, right? So if a trafficker has established a relationship with the victim through whatever means, whether it be, sometimes force and violence, where they beat the victim, and so she knows that if she doesn't do what he says, he's going to beat her again, or he's going to find her, or he's going to hurt her family. And there's certainly that, but most times it's through this love relationship where they feel a genuine loyalty towards their trafficker, and so that bond, it's very common to domestic violence situations where they will stay despite having an open door, despite having access to a car, despite even many times being in contact with their family members and never reporting it, just because of the brainwashing that goes on, where they've trained the victims to believe that if they report what's happening, they will have nothing. Nobody's going to believe them. If they report to law enforcement, they're going to get arrested. That's also very common, where you have what turns out to be piecemeal reporting from victims because, law enforcement have to spend a long time building a rapport and building a trust with that victim to actually get them to fully report. And so, and so the traffickers call it being on automatic, where they've trained the victims know what to do. And so they can have all the freedom in the world because, they know that victim's going to bring that money back and stay with them.
Regarding the prosecution of these traffickers, is there a way to still prosecute if you don't have a victim who's saying, I've been victimized, he's done this to me?
Yes. So whenever we embark on a prosecution, we always assume that we may not have all or some of our victims. And so we build our cases with that in mind, and we've had great success in doing that. Maybe, I tried a case a couple of years ago. We had a minor victim, we had an adult victim. Actually, this was a Super Bowl case, a Miami Super Bowl case. And we didn't have the minor. And so we were able to prove it with the adult victim who was there when the minor was engaging in commercial sex. Law enforcement also had an enforcement action where, the victim encountered law enforcement under the guise of law enforcement being the John or the commercial sex customer. And so they were able to talk about how the victim was dropped off to the hotel by the defendant. And then they had text message communications where they, brokered the terms of the commercial sex deal. And so we were able to prove that without the minor. So a couple of things about that. I've been a prosecutor for a really long time. I've tried a lot of different cases. I have to say that human trafficking cases are the most difficult case that I've ever had to prosecute. There's complexities in a human trafficking case that are just not present in other cases. And a lot of that has to do with the victims, and the hold that the trafficker has on the victims. And then just simply a lot of times because of the compounded trauma that the victims have experienced. At the state attorney's office, I did primarily child molestation cases. And then doing human trafficking cases, one of the things that I noticed is that the majority of my sex trafficking victims were sexually abused as children. And children who are sexually abused are most often abused by those who are close to them, really close friends, family members, coaches, whatever the relationship may be. And if you think about that, those individuals trained those victims as small children to basically live a double life, pretend that everything's okay, when meanwhile most disgusting atrocities are happening behind closed doors to them, and they have to pretend like everything's okay. And so they've been trained from a young age to live a lie. And so then when you compound that trauma with then being sex trafficked, what it results in is just an individual who is really distrusting of law enforcement, those in authority, those who are there to help, but they just don't believe it. And it's difficult work to engage in, and especially as law enforcement, the people who work these types of cases, I think, are just angels, that they subject themselves to this type of work, things that a lot of people want to pretend don't happen, because they require a lot of work, and just really good humans who are empathetic towards victims and really try to get them services so that when they come out of this life, they can actually, live an honest, healthy life.
Are there programs, that are in place to do exactly what you just said, to help them transition out of the terrors of being trafficked and get into a normal life? Are there programs around South Florida that people can call upon to help with that transition?
There are so many programs. I think because trafficking is so prevalent in South Florida, that we have really a robust anti-trafficking task forces in Miami, Broward, and Palm Beach, and they're filled with NGOs, victim service providers, who are dedicated a lot of times, to address specifically trafficking victims. In the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force, we deal with the International Rescue Committee. They're on our board, and they provide housing. And if they don't have the housing, they have all of the contacts to, they know the agencies to call. And so it's one big family sort of working together to tackle the problem. And it is a blessing to see all of these people in this space who are just there because they care. And so what I would say is, reach out to, International Rescue Committee is a big one. Catholic Charities is another. There's just so many that, even a very common thing that traffickers do to maintain that control is they do something called branding. And so they have the victim put a tattoo on their bodies that sort of marks them as the trafficker's property. I've seen, traffickers' names on the side of victims' neck, on their chest, and a lot of times it's their name, or it can be a symbol of some type. We actually have a tattoo agency who will, for free, remove those tattoos. So I would reach out if somebody has a need. I would reach out to one of the task forces in our district, and there will be somebody to help. I just an anecdote about International Rescue Committee. I mean, we were in the middle of a sex trafficking trial, and the female defendant was she was staying in a hotel by the courthouse, and it just so happened that the victim was also staying at the same hotel. And I remember getting a call from one of our attorneys saying, the victim is scared out of her mind. She doesn't want to go to court. And what can we do? And so this was really late at night on a Sunday night, and we called the International Rescue Committee, and they got her out of the hotel and put her up somewhere else. So, I mean, I have so many stories that I can give you where they have just come in and done the work, when it was most needed. So,
do you feel you're making a difference in the numbers?
I do. I think that, I've had multiple cases where when we've gone through a defendant's phone, there have been screenshots of traffickers who have been sentenced to long prison sentences. I I do think that we are deterring others from engaging in this crime. I mean, people who engage in crime, they're going to engage in crime. Like you're not going to be able to stop. It's like somebody who deals drugs, that's just their business. And so they understand that one of the hazards of the business is that they get caught sometimes and they go to prison and then they come back out, and that's just part of it. And so I do believe there is some level of that, right? But I do believe that when the public, they are consistently seeing our numbers, 25 years, 30 years, 60 years life, those are all sentences that I've personally received or others that are around me are receiving in federal court. And I know that the state's also getting really good sentences too. I believe it's making a difference, and so, we're going to continue. The thing is that when you look at the numbers, sometimes the data is not accurate. It doesn't tell the full picture. If you look at the numbers of human trafficking prosecutions in 2012 to 2022, for example, they have more than doubled. I don't think that means that there are more trafficking cases and that we're not making a dent. I think that because we are out there explaining to people what it looks like, it's being recognized at a higher rate.
Right.
So, some of those numbers I don't think are entirely reliable when you're trying to evaluate what type of difference we're making in the community.
What tips would you give someone to protect themselves or their loved ones, to protect them against human trafficking? What are some of the things? You talked a little bit about the internet being a main platform. Are there things that parents can do for stricter settings, privacy settings on phones, and on computers, desktops, whatever they have, that's giving them access to the community to the internet that makes them vulnerable to these types of predators?
I think so. I mean, when you talk about phones, I think that children should not have computers, tablets, cell phones in their bedroom or the bathroom, right? I think if, there is a value to having technology, but I think what we're seeing is, that the dangers and the risks of having the technology outweigh the benefits in a lot of ways. And so I think that it's okay to give your kids technology, but I think that we need to make sure that there are healthy restrictions on their use. When they walk in the door from school, unless they're in your presence, I don't think that there is any reason for them to be, in a private place like the bathroom, bedroom with their electronics. I think because traffickers and even those, who exploit children, I think that they are targeting those vulnerabilities. They're looking for a weakness. And so I think that we have to maintain a constant open line of communication with our kids to try to recognize any differences that we may see in their behavior. And make sure that, that you are promoting a healthy self-esteem, so that they don't need validation. They don't need external validation because they have it all within the home. I think that's really important. And making sure that you're addressing any issues, so that there aren't vulnerabilities. Like if your child is struggling with drug use, or your family member is struggling with drug use or homelessness, I think that you need to reach out early and try to help get them services, so that they're not targeted, because, it can happen very quickly and it can happen right in front of your eyes and you don't understand, because maybe the initial talk is, oh, I met, Johnny, and he loves me and he's so great. And then you start to see your loved one isolate themselves from the family. And, a lot of things that we notice, again, in domestic violence situations, it's very similar. And so, try your best to just keep talking to them. And if there is a need there, get them help, reach out for help, therapy, victim service providers, whatever you can, because you don't want to lose your loved one to exploitation.
We've talked about the internet in a general sense. Um, is social media, specifically some of the social media platforms we have, a place where people are vulnerable with requests like, will you be my friend? You know, friend requests, if you will.
Gosh, I could go on and on about the dangers of social media. I think that, kids these days, they are, constantly posting selfies of themselves. They're posting, them in bikinis on the beach.
Provocative ways.
Yes, and you have to understand that, there are applications now that predators are using to remove the clothing of kids that from pictures they're getting off of social media, such as Instagram. That is actually happening, and they're creating what we call child sexual abuse material, but legally it's called child pornography. That is a real danger. We've had multiple cases where traffickers have recruited victims through DMing them in their Instagram account.
What is it? What's the term?
DMing, direct messaging. So they
Oh,
send
okay.
a message. They send a message through Instagram, and they offer them, money. And this can happen. This can happen even when the trafficker is not in the same state as the victim. We've heard of cases. We've seen cases where they train the victims how to engage in commercial sex, how to advertise themselves, how to engage in commercial sex, and then have them wire the money to the trafficker, all while the trafficker is in a completely different state than the victim. So it is incredible how traffickers, how creative they've gotten, in how to exploit both minors and adults.
What's been your youngest victim?
11 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, for child exploitation, a lot younger, but for commercial sex, 11 years old.
One of the things that warning us on doing a little research is that be aware of advertisements that seem too good to be true. Something's enticing the child to, you could be a star, you could be a model, you could be all of these things that you read about. And so often they respond to those type of things. Again, if they have low self-esteem or they don't have support at home and they want to go out and make it big, in the industries of modeling or acting or whatever it may be. Have you had cases in those types of strategies that were used to entice them?
Yes, that Super Bowl case that I told you about that resulted in a trial, that's what happened. So one of the victims was recruited through the promise of modeling contracts and told to come to a certain house. And when she got there, the defendant said, "You're going to work for me." And then he took her on the road, and he ended up in Miami for the Super Bowl. So we've certainly seen that. There have been lots of fake modeling contract cases. There have also been cases that we've had where, come down and work in the strip club as a bottle girl, or, in the front, or, a waitress, whatever it is. And then, that's once they lure them in, and then they say, well, we need to make more money than that. This is how you can do that. Mm-hmm. And before they even realize it, they're in over their head. So yeah, that is also a common recruitment tactic.
What would, we've covered a number of areas, and I think it's been informative. One of the things I like accomplishing is that parent out there who is just naive I have, through marriage, 4 daughters. Thank God they're older and established as adults now. But, they came through a little earlier than the internet. The internet didn't play as big of a role as it's playing now. My oldest daughter, I remember buying what I think was the last physical encyclopedia before they start putting all the things on the internet. I bought a $900 set of encyclopedias that quickly were obsolete with the internet. But I smile about that, but that's a true story. The What would be your last suggested tips to parents, to teachers, to caretakers of all sorts of how to be a part of identifying trafficking and helping report trafficking that we've not touched upon?
Yeah. Gosh, I would just say, and I think I have touched on this, but I think that, as parents and as caregivers, self-esteem is so important. Instilling a positive, healthy self-esteem in your child is so important, because who you tell your child is, that will become their inner voice. I truly believe that. And if you have, don't get me wrong, there have been situations where you have a very well-adjusted, seemingly confident child who has had a great upbringing, and somehow they still fall victim to traffickers because they're just their ability to brainwash victims into believing that, come with me, it's the better way, is really strong. But I do think that a lot of victims could be saved from being exploited if we just make sure that we're pouring positivity into our children and making them feel that they don't need anybody else but their family, and that they don't need to prove anything to anybody else, as long as they feel comfortable and confident in the decisions that they're making. Because you don't want your child to seek validation from external sources. That's where they get into trouble. And so there's that. But then also, I know a lot of parents, especially parents who have introduced technology to their children, and now maybe they're 15, 16 years old and they feel like they can't walk it back. I've heard that a lot, without an incredible rebellion. I get that. And that's difficult. I would still suggest to those parents that at the end of the day, you're responsible for your child. And if your child may be upset at you for restricting them all of a sudden, that is still a lot better than losing your child to exploitation. And success stories, right? There have been a lot of cases where victims have gone on to have healthy, stable lives. But a lot of times, even when they're physically out of a trafficking situation, they have long-lasting, long-term effects. So if you can, that sometimes result in them having unhealthy romantic relationships. Maybe they then get themselves into a domestic violence situation after being in a trafficking situation because that's their normal, right? So if you can avoid that altogether for your child, I would do that. And so I would be strict. I would be strict with internet usage. I would be strict about, having devices and in private places such as bathrooms, bedrooms. I think that we need to monitor their usage. I know that that's sort of a hot button issue because you want them to have their privacy, but at the same time, you might identify unhealthy relationships before they're starting. So exploitation relationships that are before they really progress, and you can intervene and save your child. So if I would promote monitoring software. Obviously, these are all recommendations that are my personal recommendations and not representations or recommendations of the Department of Justice. But I mean, I think that monitoring software is a positive thing. I know of many cases where that is how sex trafficking and child exploitation was discovered by parents, and then I think that sometimes we bury our heads in the sand because it's difficult to hear, some of these things, and we want to pretend that it's not happening. But when it comes to your child and the health and well-being of your child, you need to have open and honest conversations with them and promote that sort of environment where they feel comfortable telling you when, a strange man said something to them on the internet, or somebody posing as a girl their age is all of a sudden offering them a phone or money or, some sort of toy if they send them pictures. That sort of thing happens. So I always say to parents that, a good rule of thumb is your child should not be talking to a person online that they have not met in real life.
Right.
So.
Well, those are all such great points, Jessica. And, the battleground is in the home from everything you're saying. I mean, I think that's the epicenter. Schools and other places where our children go, I think, I don't know how much education on trafficking is being mentioned in the middle or high school years, of our schools. I can see it can get politically debatable. I don't think it should be debated, but yeah, I think it's a good place, in addition to the home, to reinforce it. I've seen situations where when you're trying to keep juveniles, people of tender years, from going to jail, I've seen programs that show them the jail. Do you want to be here? That behavior you're participating in can get you there. So it's a scare tactic to, really walk straight, unless that's where you're going to be headed. I think some of these victims' testimonies could scare a lot of people to not step into this space because of the horrors that they experience once they've been trafficked, and it's probably hell getting them out sometime. So I commend you for your commitment to your work. It's a serious challenge in the state of Florida and around the world. Yeah, and it really is. And the fact that you've dedicated your legal career to this space is very, very important. So thank you very much, Jessica, for educating us. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work and commitment to these areas of prosecutions. Thank you so much for joining us on Can We Talk 360. We'll be back in February with a interview with someone to be announced to honor Black History Month. Until then, listen for our motivational moments, and we'll see you the next time. Thank you.
The law firm of Halitzer, Pedersen Schwam is a proud sponsor of the Can We Talk 360 podcast. Our firm handles medical malpractice, wrongful death, and catastrophic personal injury litigation. We pride ourselves in being advocates for justice on behalf of those who have been seriously injured. For decades, we've taken the lead in making your case our priority. It's who we are. It's who we'll always be. Halitzer, Pedersen Schwam. Serious injuries, proven results.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Can We Talk 360. I sincerely hope that you are inspired to seize this moment in time and take real action towards change. Remember, all change begins with a conversation. Be sure to tune in every month for more fascinating discussions and motivational food for the soul. Please share with your friends, family, and colleagues. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Can We Talk 360, and visit us on the web at www.canwetalk360.com.